Just like feeding chickens.
Pardon?
Like feeding chickens.
Well,
And other things about chickens.
chickens need feed. And they call it a chicken chart because they use it on chicken, but it's actually an element, input, output, or, let's see, needs and products, there's other ways of saying it. Who's got, hey Jen, who has a clock that can be our timekeeper for this?
I am.
Where are you?
We will. Back here, I'll give you 5.
Yeah, at 15 till, let us know, and because, hey! Did Sandy Cruz come here and we didn't notice? Hey, is there a place where we could put that?
Well, I'll just hold it up, Becky.
Okay,
Thank you.
Actually a hat.
Thank you.
okay, well, and it actually says it's 10 after 11, that's not gonna be very helpful.
Well, we can convert.
It should be like right
Okay,
at
thank you,
10.
everybody. We're breaking for lunch. That was great.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, can you all see this? As best we can, we can close more of the curtains and leave the door open. Welcome to the 4th Colorado State Permaculture Convergence. We are making progress, and I really want to thank the organizers, which is Lynn, Tana, and Elizabeth, Tana and Elizabeth are probably still outside. But great job, great people. We're getting a great base underneath us. I'm really excited to see the people from the Western Slope, Ned, and, oh, I forgot her name, wherever she is, and then the people from Utah, which is great, because this isn't really about the Front Range of Colorado. It just happens to be where it's been for the last 4 years. So we would love to have it at Crimpy next year if Jerome is okay with that. He has a great site for those of you who haven't been to Crimpy. And Telluride's doing a lot of things, so there's, it doesn't always have to be here, although this is a great venue. My name is Becky Elder. I'm with Pikes Peak Permaculture and Transition Manitou. And this is
Brian Fritz. We're co-directors of Pikes Peak Permaculture, which is its 10th year in the Pikes Peak region this year. And a transition town, Manitou Springs, which is a little community just west of Colorado Springs. It's its 4th year, but we basically serve the Pikes Peak region in terms of transition town, have been for about 4 years.
that's enough. If you want to know more about us, you can eat lunch with us. And we are talking about designing for disaster. So Brian's going to take over in just a second, but I wanted to ask, what do you think our biggest potential disaster is?
Economic collapse.
Drought.
Fire. Economic collapse.
Economic
Say
collapse,
that again.
drought, and there was one over here.
Fire.
Fire.
Fire is a big one.
We know fire.
Well, we talked
Population.
population. These are all true disasters, food, water, all kinds of things. And Brian and I were talking on the way up, and we kind of decided, and this is just our decision, that our civilization is the biggest disaster happening now.
Yes.
And so this is all part of, waking ourselves up. We have to step into this. We have to save ourselves, in case you haven't got there. This is all about self-rescue, even though you're helping your neighbors. You have to be aware. And how many of you guys have neighbors that are as aware of you as you are? Oh, a few. You're doing
Most of you.
good.
That's
We should all live with these people. Okay.
Okay.
Right, now how are we going to do this?
I'm not sure.
Will you tap it?
Well, you can tap it, or I'll tap it. Why don't I tap it
All right.
as we go
I'll
along?
just stay out of the way.
So what do we see up here? Can you see this? What kind of events? We call these disasters, but these are actually events. What do we see? Can you just call
Flood.
it flood? Yeah?
Too many people.
Nuclear reactors.
Yes. Look at this one.
Economic collapse.
Drought.
Drought.
Or dead animals.
Nukes, you can't see this, these are nukes.
Yeah, so these are all, I just want to start out with this, well, come on. Okay, I want to make, the first note I want to make is that disaster, there are no disasters in nature. Okay, disaster is a human concept. Disaster is actually something that emerges in our awareness, in our conceptual awareness. It's overlaid on what's happening. There's no real disasters that happen in nature. Nature is balanced and flows, and everything that actually happens in nature serves every other part of nature fluidly. So disaster is really a human concept. It's really human-centric, right? I mean, if we get flooded out, we get flooded out. I get flooded out. The human gets flooded out. So we call it a disaster. And it's appropriate, actually, for planning purposes, to look at these things and actually, label it. But I want to start out by just making, having that awareness that there are no real disasters in the natural world. There are really actually no real disasters in the human world. We're going to talk a little bit about the two types of disasters, natural and man-made. And even man-made disasters are just feedback. We're just getting feedback. It's that principle, self-regulation and accept feedback. Even man-made disasters are just giving us feedback about how we're functioning. The first thing I want to point out, we can't really design for disaster if we can't look at it.
Right.
We have to be able to observe what we want to look at and be aware that there's a potential disaster emerging. Now, the psychology of disaster for most of us, almost all of us, certainly collectively, is dominated by psychological denial. We hate to look at disasters. We hate to think of things that, that might affect us in what we would term a negative way. So our egoic personal sense of self has really these massive structures of denial that disallow us, for the most part, of looking straight at a situation and sort of seeing it as a potential disaster to begin with, and then actually being able to plan, mitigate for that disaster, which is what permaculture design for disaster is about. It's about seeing potential disasters and then actually using our creativity and intelligence to actually design infrastructure to mitigate the disaster or to actually eliminate it altogether, particularly if it's man-made. So, denial leads to avoidance, okay, and avoidance usually leads to not being properly prepared for the disaster. There are a number of principles and ethics about the actual designing for disaster. First principle is that the first principle is the most important thing is we save lives. And the secondary is taking care of our property or saving property. I mean, this is almost obvious, but it's good to point out. We want to be able to plan for disaster ahead of time. Okay, obviously. Again, the egoic denial that we have to deal with to even look at potential disasters tends to frustrate this principle. Particularly, we see this in our collective, communities. We see this in our nation. I mean, we've been talking about climate change and for decades, and even now, climate change has sort of become somewhat of a front page sort of in a sense reality. 98 out of 100 scientists recognize the actual valid fact of climate change, that our industrial behavior is having a negative influence on the climate. And yet nothing is being done. The truth is nothing is being done. Absolutely nothing.
Exactly.
Absolutely nothing.
I'll shut
I mean, you hear little things here and there, but the scope of the problem, nothing is being done. That's because people have this psychological denial.
Right.
It's huge, and it's hard to look at. We want to design to reduce the impact of the disaster that's occurring. We want to design to endure the worst aspect of the disaster. We want to look at the time scales. Is it a week-long fire like we had down in Colorado Springs this summer? We didn't know it was going to be a week long. I mean, they were looking at a month. We had the highways closed, but it ended up being a week. Probably 2 weeks.
It was like 10 days.
Like 10 days. It's hard to actually predict, but this is part of designing for disaster. You look at something, a potential fire, and then you try to determine, how long is it going to last? How long is it going to affect our normal everyday
and
behavior?
Just like Katrina, I wanted to get this in there. They knew, Colorado Springs knew that we have potential to burn. We still have potential to burn. We were actually lucky that the fire was where it was. We lost 362 homes.
It was on the north side of that
It was
highway.
on the north side of the highway where there's plenty of roads. We still have the whole south side of the highway where there's no access, and if it gets over there, which we're still in fire season, this fire was outside of fire season, but it's just like Katrina. They knew the potential was there, but it's a huge amount of stepping up and money, equipment, people to prepare for something like a wildfire. So they just didn't do anything.
Yeah, our tendency is to move it out into the future, and just hope that it doesn't occur. But by doing that, we actually let, the future peoples or the future generations actually have to deal with the disaster. Now, a disaster profile, what's the cause? Pick a disaster, pick your favorite disaster, right? And there are many potential disasters. And what's the cause of it? What's the potential cause of it? Is it natural? Is it emerging in the natural world? Or is it man-made? And oftentimes these things are, we'll talk a little bit, these things are related. What's the possible frequency? Do we get a flood every year? Do we get a 10-year flood? Do we get a 50-year flood? Sometimes we get smaller floods, and then we'll get a 50-year flood or a 100-year flood. Do we want, what's the frequency of the scale of the disaster? We want to take that into account. What's the duration? A lot of natural disasters are very fast. A tornado comes through very quickly. And so the duration of the actual disaster is very quick, but it may take quite a while. It may affect us in such a way that it takes actually quite a while to get back to what we would call normal functioning. And so we want to take that into account as well. What's the speed of the onset? Now, natural disasters, sometimes you can predict them. There are man-made disasters, which we'll look at, and those are actually pretty predictable if you're willing to look at what's actually going on. And yet, that's a little, those are a little bit harder to determine. What's going to happen? It's been actually stated by the World Energy Commission that peak oil world peak oil happened in 2006. In 2010 they put out a report for the energy situation for the planet. And they actually used the term peak oil. And they said it happened in 2006. And yet, we have no idea. If you really know what's going on, you can see some of the influences. But as far as it really hitting all of us, we don't know when that's going to happen or what that's going to look like. We can speculate. We want to take a look at its potential destructive value. And destruction, again, is only in terms of what we would determine our normal functioning. But these are some of the profiles and things we want to think about when we're designing to mitigate disaster. What's the population density? A tornado on the prairie, we can sit there all day long and watch it. It's beautiful. But it's coming through our community, it actually has a different effect on the population where we live. So, is it predictable? A lot of natural disasters, natural phenomena that we would consider disasters. We know patterns in nature. We've been studying patterns in nature, so some of these can be predictable. I'm actually going to suggest the man-made disasters that are kind of occurring now are much more predictable than the natural ones. If you're willing to take a look, again, it's that egoic denial structure that disallows us from actually looking at what's happening. And can we control? Can we set up any types of controls that might mitigate the disaster? Some design tips. Again, analyze the possible frequency of the event. You can actually apply permaculture zone and sector analysis to the area, to the spot where the disaster may occur, and that helps mitigate. It helps setting up infrastructure that may mitigate the potential disaster. Practice precaution. If you know some place is a floodplain, don't build your McMansion on the floodplain.
Yeah.
That's just practicing precaution.
Don't build a
Or even your cabin. Even a cabin, even a sustainable straw bale house, don't build on the floodplain. Utilize all the permaculture principles in design. All of them are useful. All of them fit into a disaster mitigation program. This is the most important principle in permaculture. They're all important. But if you don't do this one, if you can't do this one, then all the others are going to miss their mark. Okay, again, and this is the hardest one. Because in this culture, we're not used to observing. Other cultures, you know, have a tradition or where observation and being quiet inside and noticing what's going on around you, it's more intact in those cultures than it is in the Western culture. So this one's very, very difficult in our culture to do. Okay, in general it's hard to do. You know, if you sit down and try to sit for half an hour and just observe what's going around you, you know, the internal dialogue is going to give you trouble. We all know that. But let alone if you're actually observing around the phenomenon of what we consider disaster, which is automatically the structure of denial, psychological denial, comes in, tries to move us away from looking at that. It makes it much more difficult to observe. So this is actually very challenging. Recognize the eco-function. Again, this comes back to the fact that the word disaster, the concept of disaster, is a human concept. It's human-centric. Okay? When there's cyclical flooding, it's nature's way of distributing resources. Okay? If we weren't here, there would, you know, everything would flow. Everything flows perfectly. Okay? And then what?
I can address this with
Yeah.
fire. You know, we've had this big fire, and now everybody's worried about landslides, mudslides, and we've had some. But so here we are. You know, fire suppression was, you know, Smokey the Bear was wrong. Fire suppression was not necessarily a good thing, and so now they are madly trying to mitigate all these mudslides. At the same time, the fire comes through and burns, and it can make hydrophobic soils. It so intensely burns the soil that it doesn't accept water. So if you think about the eco-function of a mudslide, here comes all this fresh soil, new seeds, everything comes up to the surface. So it actually has a natural function. But we look at it and go, oh my God, the soil's moving. We've got to keep everything the same. So that, to me, is trying to control all the mudslides, not another class 1 error, just like fire suppression was a class 1 error. We did it for 100 years, and that's why we're dealing with what we're dealing with.
Right. And, you know, in generally as a human population, what we've been doing is not considering. We don't even know really that nature, you know, we do, sort of, that nature is alive and functions and has purpose and intelligence and interaction, purposeful interaction. But we don't look at these things before we build cities. We just say, oh, this would be a great, you know, there's a reason we build by water, or there's a reason, but it's usually, suits us. Again, it's human-centric. So we don't really take into account really clearly and really observing, you know, what's going on in this area before we move in this huge population. Talk about disasters.
Oh, we'd be fine.
No, we would.
Okay, what's going on? Hit the arrow and try the arrow. There you go.
Okay. Again, it's redistributing and recycling natural resources. Recognize the impact of population, not as, you know, we recognize the impact on population. Okay, that's human-centric. But we rarely recognize the impact of population on the natural cycles and what that does to actually have what we would call natural disasters emerge. Okay, we can have a direct effect we can have a direct effect on what we would call natural disasters emerging. It's starting to be seen that there's maybe an influence between fracking and earthquakes. Okay, that's starting to be recognized. Okay, but that's a direct effect. But a more subtle effect is the population, the large populations of human beings not living in alignment with nature. I mean, they're natural laws, and most of us, 7 billion of us, aren't really living in alignment with natural law. And this non-alignment, this type of living, actually creates a stressful influence in the actual natural environment, and that actually can give rise, you can look at natural, events taking place, windstorms and so, as a way to sort of mitigate the effect of a large body of human beings not living in accordance with natural law. So, the impact of population, which we rarely look at in this culture. I'm going to skip that one for now. There's two types of disasters, natural and man-made. Again, what do we see here? These are a number of natural, what we would call natural disasters. Again, some of these we saw in the first one. Can you see these?
Earthquake.
You can just call them out
Gone.
if you like.
Drought. Tornado. Fire.
Tsunami, we don't have to worry about that one yet. Fire,
100-year flood.
that's
Yes.
true. That would be a hell of a flood, wouldn't it? So these are natural disasters that we can actually, in our area, and again, it's area specific. Okay, we don't have to worry about really tsunamis. We don't really have to worry about earthquakes at this point.
Not yet.
Which ones would we have to actually be concerned with? Tornadoes? Drought? Fires? Huh?
Blizzard.
Blizzard? Tornado?
Ice storm.
Ice storms? Yeah, ice storms.
Avalanche.
Yeah, in some places.
In some places, avalanche, yeah. But these can all be looked at and determined if it, the probability of it happening, the frequency, and design methodology can be applied to mitigate against some of these disasters.
I think it goes to sleep in between.
Okay, and then there's man-made disasters. And there's two types. There's individual events, and there's systemic collapse. Now these are some examples of individual events. You see these? What are these?
Oil spill.
Yeah, oil spill, BP. That was a man-made disaster.
It's like pesticides and other chemicals in the lake or river. Probably green, like algae bloom because
Fires, explosions, terrorism, a man-made
Nukes.
individual event. That's, and a lot of these can be seen as individual events in themselves, but a lot of them have relationships with systemic collapse or the cultural activity we may be doing that leads to the individual event. That oftentimes isn't looked at. It's oftentimes isn't looked at.
Most of the time.
Most of the time we don't look at it. Again, we're in denial about why things are happening. What are all the types of systemic collapse that can occur? This is one. This is economic. Our economic system, the way we distribute goods and services, the way we use our money, the money that we use, how it's made, who makes it, all this is our economic activity. So that's a system that can serve us, and for a while it has served some of us, can serve some of us and not others. Also, all systems can thrive if they're actually aligned with certain principles, or they can collapse if they're not. Okay? What other types of system, man-made system, can you think about that might have a propensity to collapse, or not only collapse but thrive? All these systems.
Industrial agriculture.
yeah.
Yeah, industrial agriculture, our food systems. Yeah.
Healthcare.
Healthcare is a great one.
Housing.
Energy.
Housing, energy, our energy systems, how we create our, bring in our energy into our culture. Housing, how we shelter people in this culture. How we think about sheltering people.
Our water system.
Water systems.
Political system.
Communication.
Our political system is certainly can thrive and serve us, serve the citizens, or it can actually not.
Would the stock market be considered economic?
Absolutely, that's like a subsystem of the whole economic system.
Judicial system?
Yeah, the criminal justice system, that's an oxymoron.
That's why we like Brian.
But there's, environmental, there's cultural, our cultural system, which seems a little vague. What is our cultural system? What's the American cultural system? What does that mean?
greed.
Huh?
It's greed.
Well, yes, it's great. Yes, right now, it's, you know, it's been based more on, well, that's part of it, yeah. But there's a lot of elements in our cultural system that can thrive, and thriving means it supports people. It supports human beings. And collapsing means it actually doesn't support human beings being able to live healthy and free. And of course, our food systems were mentioned, water, energy, our transportation systems. I mean, really, we're selling more and more and more cars on this planet. I mean, it's just insane. It's like, you know, our car is sustainable. Our car is sustainable in China, in India. You know, they all want to live like us. They're all, China and India are all mimicking us. They all want to live like us. That's what they're doing right this second.
I'd like to draw a distinction here with cultural.
Yeah.
Culture is something that'll never go away. Culture is teaching our kids, growing our own food, singing and dancing, having friends. You know, that's really our culture, our artwork. And we can do art, just ask Marco Lamb, you can draw in the ground, in the dirt with a stick and create things. But the civilization has taken over that, and that's really what portends to collapse, and that's what we were talking about earlier. So, because culture will always, because that's with our species.
Yeah.
But our civilization that we have hung all of our dependency on, that's what's prone, that's what's going to collapse
Yeah.
sometime soon.
And civilization can be seen as a particular type of culture, right? That either serves us or it doesn't, and that's, you know, that's a big debate.
Yes.
Not here, but elsewhere. It does go to sleep.
Yeah, I think it goes through.
Come on.
You know, they say don't buy new tech, fix your old stuff. Yeah, there are a few drawbacks to that.
Okay. So here's some images and some examples of what we would call systemic collapse. Collapse that takes place on a broader scale than just an individual collapse. Again, we can see a variety of different types. There's housing collapse, and you know, the housing, which way, what?
The positive proof of global
Oh, you like it?
Positive proof of global warming, from the Knickers to the G-string.
You know, we talked about financial and economic collapse,
Unintended consequences.
unintended consequences, money collapse. You know, it's happened before in other cultures. It's hard to believe, you know, our currency could go into hyperinflation at some point. That's a possibility. It's not going to happen soon, but it's happened in other cultures that makes your money worthless. And then you start dealing in a different type of currency that's non-monetary.
Like Greece.
Like what? Like Greece. Well, yes, you see it happening in other places. Iceland, Greece, all of these currencies and government structures have collapsed. But, you know, it's interesting. When I talk about collapse, of course, I forget. I'm with this all the time. I forget what people think about when I talk about collapse, that we're all going to be gone. It's like death. Collapse doesn't mean the human race is going to be gone. It means we're going to be living differently we have to learn to live differently than we do right now. Now, for most people, most egos, that sounds like, you know, a disaster. If I can't drive my car with no one in it, we took the hub lane. You know what hub lanes are? I mean, it was like, whoa, do we take it or do we not? You know, it's like, you know, and yet, okay, every time Becky and I come up, it's like, whoa, what is it? Is it okay? There's two people in the car, right? So I said, okay, let's try it. Zoom, and it's great. We're the only ones in the hub lane. You know, 80, 90, 100 miles an hour. It's like the Autobahn. You know, it's great. I love it. But I don't even know why I'm talking about this.
It's real.
It's real, yeah. And no one else is in there. And, you know, it's our culture. So these are different examples. And, you know, this is happening right now. All these collapses are happening right now. Our culture is in irreversible and rapid collapse in all of these areas. Again, we don't like to look at this. Let's take the food system, for example. Food system has been in irreversible and rapid collapse for decades. What are some of the elements of the food system that are in collapse? You all know this.
Pollinators.
Your pollinators are disappearing. Just that one element, we're sunk.
Soil fertility.
Soil fertility, forget fertility.
Just soil.
Topsoil's gone.
Yeah.
It's gone.
Obesity.
Obesity, the health of our nation. And what?
Lack of farmers.
Lack of farmers, lack of rural farmers, lack of urban farmers. Lack of close, fresh food. Fresh, the word fresh is a joke. You go into 7-Eleven, everything's fresh. The donuts are fresh. You know, the Twinkies are fresh. Right? I mean, decades ago, that would have been illegal. That actually would have been illegal. That's had to creep in on us slowly. Okay? It's a profitized food system.
Exactly. The governmental side.
It's a profitized food system.
Our seed source.
Subsidies.
The Monsantos.
Seed sources, Monsanto's. But, you know, yeah, it's profitized. And you profitize, if you profitize, it doesn't mean you can't make profit. There are non-profit companies, they all make profit. That used to confuse me. They used to go, non-profit corporation, okay, fine, doesn't make any profit, right? No, that's what I thought. And then I realized, no, it's not that it doesn't make any profit, it has to make profit. Profit is, you know, embedded in nature. But in nature shares all its profits with everything around it. Okay, non-profit corporation makes profit. Its purpose, it's just that it's been set up as a legal entity, so its purpose is not profit. Its purpose is for whatever its function is, right? A credit union is to serve its shareholders, not to make profit. A bank, its only purpose is to make a profit. That's its only purpose. So it doesn't care about you, it doesn't care about your children, it doesn't care about the land, it doesn't care about, it legally can't care about it legally can't care about anything. It legally can't take any action. Anything other than making a profit. Okay, and our culture is embedded in that paradigm right now. A profitized culture. And so our food system is profitized. That means they don't care about the quality of the food. They don't care who dies, who gets sick. They don't care about obesity. You know, right now our profitized food system is in collapse. Of course, it's in collapse. Okay, it will collapse, not only in its nutritional value. It's been said that our nutritional value in our food has declined 50% since the 1950s. Okay, that's you know, if you think about that, that's a huge crisis happening right now. Everyone's sicker. Everyone's, you know, let alone obesity. Now the food system, the profitized food system, serves the profitized medical system. It's a perfect relationship. Right? We get them, you know, we feed them food that makes them ill, then they go right into the medical system. So this is an example of a system, a systemic collapse in one of the human-designed systems. Now, it's beautiful. What's beautiful about this is design for disaster. Our culture has actually been designed for disaster. It's brilliant. It's used principles and ethics to design itself into a disaster. The good news about that is that we can design ourselves out of disaster. That's the good news. It's just a matter of using different principles and different ethics. And you know, we're doing, you know, Brian and Amanda are doing that at the farm here. We're using a different set of ethics and principles to design a food system that's actually sustainable and serves the human physiology, serves the human body, as opposed to actually, you know, fills it with disease. Wake up. Wake up. Wake up. You gotta speak to it nicely. Okay, well, the last point here is that the trend on this planet is towards further urbanization. That's all. We've been urbanizing. We've been moving people out of the rural areas for the last 100, 150 years. We've been moving them into cities. It's not necessarily to serve people, okay? But it tends to be. I want you to be aware of this trend. That the trend is towards larger and larger urban areas. That's, you know, both on one hand, that's something to be aware of as far as, you know, disaster, but it's also, if you use the right principles and the right kind of perspective on this, and the right design principles, that can actually, you know, urban areas of a lot of people can actually come together and redesign their environments, even living together like that, so to meet all of our needs. All of our needs can be, you know, designed even in large cities, especially in large cities, actually. There's an advantage to large cities over rural areas. There can be.
And I've heard the idea that closely packed living situation is a more efficient use of energy.
Yes, more efficient use of energy, there's water, you know, there's land, there's huge land.
And technically much more sustainable.
Much more
being
sustainable.
rural, because you don't have to drive, there's more water off the roofs, there's more labor to do the things that we want to do. I mean, we've been doing all this labor with fossil fuels which we have to get back to human scale and start using people and animals. Remember horses? You know, that do work for us.
And culture.
So the cities, you know, and permaculture would say, I think about all those million of acres of Monsanto land, Cargill, of, you know, dying industrial farms, and we don't want to move out there. We need to give that land back to the earth so that earth can start setting up the base again so we can actually survive here for a long time. So cities are actually very much more sustainable. We just have to catch up with it and bring our friends and create these systems, and we can be very happy.
And plus it preserves the land, like outside of the cities, instead of a lot of people moving out there and, oh, I'm gonna have a farm, and I'm gonna have a farm, and I'm
And
gonna
that's
have a
right,
farm.
there's
It
a
allows
lot of
it-
people that base their sustainability on having property, or having there's lots of property in cities. We just worked on our last design course on a school garden. It's a fabulous design, and the head of the board was sitting next to me, and he goes, the school board, he goes, gosh, we've got lots of lots like this, we should be doing that on every single one. I'm going, yeah, you think? That'd be great. So there's actually lots of land in urban, and if you look at what's happening climatically, there's less water, but there's more water off of all the buildings. Every time you build a building, it's an opportunity to harvest water.
Yeah, and it allows some of this land that's been developed to move back into Zone 5. Permaculture Zone 5.
We need Zone 5.
We need Zone 5. It's,
Well, I don't necessarily think Wes Jackson or Joel Stoltz would agree with that. Like, I think they would say, like, we need smart design. We need to aid in the healing of the agricultural lands and go in and set up perennialized systems and do keyline design. And
yeah, that's
do-
needed.
Well, that's
And that's
all
Zone
true.
4.
All that
That's Zone
stuff.
4.
But what I'm talking
Yeah,
about
sorry.
are the people coming, and they grew up in the city, and they're going, I'm gonna go out and take some raw land, I'm gonna make a farm. And there is a certain amount of truth to that, but also in the scope of what Brian has told you, we have 7 billion people plus on the planet. That number is not sustainable, I don't care what you're doing. And we are going to have issues, which, you know, you kept it nice and light.
I did.
But we are facing some real dramatic situations with our population. Thank you. Thank you to our little clock arm back there. So it's not that we don't want farmers, we do want farmers. What we don't want is having people flooding all over the land. You know, and I grew up in the prairie. Most people don't even know what the prairie's about because we've turned most of it. But it needs to go, it's actually more abundant if we're not in there messing with it. If we could turn buffalo loose, empty out those little towns that have already sucked the aquifer dry, and give it back to nature, it will actually be more abundant for us. And what we're really going to need, I think, is places for our spiritual restoration, because we have lost our contact with nature. And that's another urban thing too. I'm big on the dark skies.
So when you go back to a city, how are you going to connect with nature? If you're in
Urban
a city.
farming.
Urban farming, bringing what you need into the city. You know, Havana, Cuba grows 80% of its food within the city limits. That's the kind of stuff we need. And you do, I'm not saying all the farms can't be restored, and how fast is that going to happen? I was just talking to Joel Salton 3 weeks ago,
Few
or a
weeks
month
ago.
ago. He's a fabulous guy, and he's really got the answer. But the answer to me, and what I was saying was, the answer isn't that everybody has a farm, and everybody is turning the soil, and you know, we don't need that. We only need like 10% of the people involved with growing food, and there'll be enough, and we can scale back. What we need to do is scale back our population. And so if we keep growing food, that fuels population. You know, and as hardcore as that sounds, you know, we need to do that. We need to scale back. Yeah, I know. So anyway, that's a lunchtime discussion. And I love both those guys. Wes Jackson started where I grew up in Matfield Green. I didn't grow up in Matfield Green, but that's where, and it's beautiful. And what he's doing is great. So I have no issues with those guys, and they're fine. Is that kind of clear to you guys, or is that muddy as dirty water?
Money's money, water.
Okay.
I think a big part of the big ag problem is that we're not growing food, we're growing additives.
That's
and
right.
Absolutely
high
right.
fructose
We're
corn
growing
syrup.
subsidies.
It's like if we-
Okay, we're gonna run short on time. I need 5 volunteers. Okay?
These ideas of ethics and principles and guilds and things like that, to working with people to some of those invisible structures, because that's kind of essential to doing that work well in a city. And so that's kind of why I'm here. Stephanie?
My name is Stephanie Sison. I manage the Central Rocky Mountain Permaculture Institute in Basalt with Jerome, who spoke yesterday. Yeah, people guilds are really important systems to have in place. We have a very small situation at Crimpy, and bringing the right people in could really take us forward. So I'm very interested in how people work together and how people communicate well to each other to get the most beneficial situation for whatever they're doing.
So yeah, we're basically gonna be doing some talking for the first part of this hour, and then kind of make it a little bit interactive for the second half. But both sections are going to be about this idea of what we're calling a people guild. So it's, you know, the theme of this year's Convergence is building the guild. And so we thought we'd take that, we kind of build upon that idea of the plant guild and talk about how some of the similar concepts can apply pretty directly to how we work in groups, whether those groups are people we live with, our family, people we work with, people we're doing, you know, activist work with, people we're designing with. No matter where you live, even if it's kind of in the middle of nowhere, chances are you're working with other people on a regular basis. And how you work with those people, how you communicate with them, how you get things done with them is a design process in the same way that planting a garden is a design process. And so we can apply some of those same principles to how we do that work. And so, you know, it's one of those things that is kind of at the growing edge of permaculture in, you know, figuring out how to very kind of concretely apply some of these principles. And so that's, you know, certainly in me and Stephanie's growing edge as well. And so we're kind of working out these theories ourselves. So we definitely welcome your guys' input and ideas and feedback and advice as we kind of go through this hour together. So I think we wanted to start with just kind of talking about invisible structures as a whole and what those mean and ways to start kind of thinking about what some of the kind of big principles of invisible structures are. So, you know, to define invisible structures, it's a term that comes up a lot in permaculture, but if you haven't taken a PDC, or even if you have, you might not be familiar with it. They're essentially those intangible elements that are necessary to the functioning of a healthy system. So all the things that you can't see in a system, but that are just as important to make it work. And so as permaculture designers, we want invisible structures that are regenerative, just like our physical structures. So we want those invisible things to be things that are taking care of themselves, at least in the long term. They might not be that way at the get-go. But we want to design ways for people to interact with each other, leadership systems, governance systems, that don't require the constant time and energy of one person. So that, yeah.
So kind of that goes off of like a guild. Most of you know what a guild is, why we would create one. There's certain elements we're bringing together. They're going to have different offerings and different needs. And so the same thing works with people. So we want to develop and design it well so that things are being provided for, all the needs are being satisfied without a lot of outside input, with them really taking care of themselves. And so it's really the same principles, your nutrient accumulators, your fodder crops, your nitrogen fixers, your big yield products, all coming together to create a synergistic whole that's better than the parts.
And so this is the idea where the people guild comes in. And so it's this concept of looking at the people in a group as different species in a system. And just as in a guild of plants where each species of plant has something to contribute to that soil food web, each person in a collaborative group has something valuable to contribute. And so the design comes in understanding what each person's strengths and skills are and creating mutually beneficial interconnections rather than competition. So say, you know, instead of planting two nitrogen fixers right next to each other where they're going to compete with each other, you space them out. And similarly, in a people guild, if there's people with a similar skill set, you don't put them on the same thing where they're going to butt heads. Maybe you divide them up into different sections of what the group needs to do. And so it's amazing, the more I've started thinking this way, the more I can see there's just all kinds of immediate parallels to the way we forest garden and the way we kind of work together as groups. So there's kind of just a few other patterns in general that we wanted to talk about with people guilds. When you talk about kind of invisible structures and the way people work together, there's a couple kind of archetypal patterns of the hierarchy and the network. And you know, hierarchical systems, top-down systems are ones that we're probably more familiar with in the society that we live in, where there's a very clear chain of command. There's often multiple levels of that chain, as you know, in a big business or in government or army, things like that. And it's a very efficient way of doing things, but it's also very disempowering for the people at the bottom, and it can be prone to disaster if something happens at one of these crucial levels. You know, if a big miscommunication happens here, or people are misusing resources, things like that, it can be very dysfunctional. Meanwhile, the network is one that's kind of more horizontal. People are on more or less the same plane, and that often leads to more innovation. It's kind of inherently more egalitarian, but it also has its challenges. It's less efficient because you have more of these connections. Sometimes it's hard to understand where the right decision-making structure is, and who gets to decide if there's a conflict in that group. And so each of these different kind of archetypes, neither of them are inherently good or bad, but they each have their roles. And so part of the role of the designer in these invisible structures is an understanding where to apply this model and where to apply this one, and really how to interweave them, because in any invisible structure you'll see that there's elements of both of them, and sometimes you have a small network that's part of a larger hierarchy, or vice versa. Do you want to talk about the tyranny of structurelessness?
Right, so, and this kind of got brought up yesterday as well. There's an idea that as opposed to all this structure and government and how it's so oppressive, and that we want to go the other way and say, well, we can just all do what we want and it'll all be right and we'll all pick up and put in and it'll work out. But that doesn't tend to happen. This theory of structurelessness, there's going to be structure. People get together, they're going to create structure. We're either going to talk about it and put it on the table and clearly lay out what our structure is, or there'll be little subtle structures that come into play. People have different strengths, people are organizers, people are leaders, and that's going to come out whether you design for it or not. But is it going to, are we just going to say, oh, everybody's just going to do whatever they want and let those little things be invisible and let us not talk about them and let little power struggles go on? Or we're just going to put it on the table and design for it. There are people who are prone and good at these certain positions, and so let's just be transparent. Let's design for it so that everybody can work together.
So in some ways it's kind of, the tyranny of structurelessness is like assuming that every plant in a forest garden does the same things and requires the same amount of light and the same amount of water, and so we should just all plant them wherever and they'll all be happy together. But really, you know, as we know, in permaculture, it's about thoughtful application of these, it's about embracing that diversity and using it to our advantage through thoughtful design and really taking our time to understand the different needs and yields of these different systems. And it's not just about mishmashing them all together, but creating a network where each interconnection is on purpose. And so that's kind of the idea behind, you know, getting away from that tyranny of structurelessness, is creating a structure that is, you know, if we want it to be egalitarian, then it's egalitarian, but it's egalitarian in a very specific way, and that there is authority, but it's authority that's consented to, instead of authority that is kind of demanded from above. So I just wanted to talk real briefly about some of the different kind of archetypes of folks you might find in these people guilds. So, you know, just as in a plant guild, you might have a kind of central tree and a dynamic accumulator and a nitrogen fixer and things like that. There's kind of a set of different roles that, you know, might not be present in every single guild, but they come up often. So you might have a leader or an elder. And this is the person maybe that was kind of the initial impetus for the founding of whatever group it is. They're the one that has this big vision and they're real kind of excitable and charismatic and things like that. Or alternately, you know, in the kind of elder archetype, they're just someone with a lot of wisdom that people naturally want to listen to and want to learn from.
Radicals.
Yeah.
Being another person, so a radical, people who just have crazy ideas and they're willing to go out on the edge and they're not looking to be necessarily popular or the same thinking that's been done before, not repetitive. They're just they're really putting it all out there, willing to make a change.
And one thing that I think is really powerful is this relationship between the elder and the radical. I feel like they kind of balance each other out in a lot of ways, where the elder is someone, you know, that's been through the struggle and, you know, maybe started out more radical and has learned from their mistakes over time about what works and what doesn't. And then the radical is the person who's kind of always pushing the boundaries, always trying to find new ways of doing things that, you know, maybe the elder hadn't even thought of before. And so they kind of need each other in order to have the best functioning guild. There are kind of another axis is the kind of visionary and the implementer, right? You guys have all probably been in groups where there's people who have like lots of big cool ideas and they're really good at coming up with cool ideas, but not very good at actually doing them, right? Follow through, yeah. And so it's good, it's important to have those big ideas, otherwise you don't have something to rally around. But then you also need those people who are able and talented at and willing to actually get that stuff done, which is, you know, 90% of the work. Just doing all the details of, you know, calling people or making spreadsheets or, you know, all that kind of mundane stuff, but that's really important. And so well-functioning groups have both of those, and both people are comfortable in those positions. You have anything to add to that part?
No, I mean, that leads right into the network weavers. So network weavers are really important. Not only are they able to weave your small network together and keep everybody kind of moving and talking, but they're able to take your group and move it out into the public. So to weave with the society at large, the community around you. You can only do so much good when you're huddled in a circle. And there's some people who are really comfortable in that circle, and then some people who are very outgoing and very communicative and want to bring in other people and share your message and have a lot of energy and enthusiasm and charisma, and want to bring your message to a larger audience.
And that's kind of a similar role, but slightly different, of the translator. The translator is someone who can take the kind of internal culture of a group and make it understandable to a totally different group. So it doesn't necessarily have to be literally translating from one language into another as much as translating from one kind of culture or subculture into another. And certainly, I know for me, living in a city where there's so many different types of people living in the same physical space, these translators are really important to, you know, take, say, an idea of organic food and permaculture, gardening, and make that accessible to someone who might not care about that, but cares about the health of their kids. And so if you can explain to them why growing a garden is going to save you money and make your kids healthier, then they can get on board with it. So understanding what a different community is interested in, what drives them, and how to take what drives this group and make them kind of see eye to eye. That's a really important skill.
I think translators is a hugely important skill. I really am fascinated by it. I really like to understand how different people hear the same thing, essentially, and how you can take the same message and repackage it so that it's not so immediately offensive. I think a lot of people, perhaps when they speak, and me sometimes too, we're more concerned with talking than we are for people actually hearing us. And the way you present your message based on that, do you just want to talk and say what you want to say, or do you actually want someone to hear you? Those are two totally different ways of presenting yourself. So I think that it's like Adam said, it's really important. You can say organic, and a lot of people will scoff at that. But then if you just say, well, like your grandma used to do it, it's not organic, it's just a word that we use now. Your great grandma used to do it this way. And then the barriers are broken down and they can actually begin to listen and to hear what you're talking about.
So I think we wanted to move to talk about a few case studies of how Stephanie and I have observed these patterns, either working well or not so well, and how we could see them working better in situations from our own life. But before we do that, are there maybe one or two questions of stuff we've done thus far? Yeah, great.
I just had you put network weavers and translators as plural and leader, elder, and radicals singular. I don't know if that was a
No.
intentional or not. Okay. But I guess, and maybe we'll speak to this in the case studies, but it brings up the question that are there optimal kind of ratios or amounts of people, like you have one fruit tree, but you've got a lot of several comfort plants, or you had one binding plant and several root crops or whatever.
That's a great
Do you
question.
think that is a one-to-one correlation? Does that work out in people guilds as well, or?
Yeah, I mean, I could speculate on it, but honestly, my answer would be just as good as yours. So
Yeah.
I think that's something for us all to observe and see. Yeah.
I was wondering if you were going to address, as you go through the case studies, the issue of how to identify these people, because when you have a new group that comes together, you don't really know people, you haven't had an opportunity to see how people interact yet, and maybe you don't even know for yourself who you are, because sometimes you have someone who's never really participated very much, and then they find themselves in a very passionate situation, they kind of emerge into one of these roles in a really phenomenal way, and so,
Yeah.
I know, when you're building a guild, like a new guild, you have to do a little bit of experimentation and
Right.
things work and don't work, but I just was wondering if you would have any insight, or, maybe if anybody later could contribute some insight into, if there are any ways
That's a
to
great point, and
identify.
it's something I actually wanted to bring up and forgot, so I'm glad that you brought it up, is there's kind of a process of how these groups form. And oftentimes we want to rush that process and get right to the kind of, exciting stuff, but that really in any group, there's a set of steps that a group has to go through in order to understand how people relate to each other and what those kind of unspoken or maybe explicitly spoken rules are, and where everybody is in that guild. And oftentimes people, it's called forming, norming, storming, and performing, right? Where a group kind of forms around some big idea, common theme. They create their kind of internal norms of what's okay to talk about and do in this group, and what behavior is kind of taboo. And then there's this process of conflict that's actually really necessary and important, of like where are the edges of different people interacting with each other, and what are the types of conflict that could come up, and how are we going to deal with them in this group? What is our pattern for doing that? And only once you make it through all of those three previous phases can you actually start performing, or doing the actual work that you were set out to do. So I think, I don't know if there's one specific way that always happens in a group, but it's important to recognize that does happen. There is this kind of loose time of people figuring out what their place is in a group, and if we're aware of that and conscious of looking for some of those different roles and who might be best at filling them, it's going to make our ultimate kind of performing stage that much more successful and maybe come a little bit quicker.
So there's an article I have in the car, I'll get it for you to bring it in, but it talks specifically to what you're asking. One is about using our skills of observation and not trying to force something right away, so observing each other, communicating with each other, but then also, once we figure out that we have these skills or talents, yes, we're kind of in that role, but not locking steadfast into it, having these points where you would then rotate around, or you would join someone else in your team to learn about what they're doing, because you may be really great at administrative skills and have this hidden talent that you never knew you had, and if you just get locked into that one position, then not only does the group not get to utilize that hidden talent you have, but you don't get to explore it either. So there's a balance between keeping people in the role that they're doing, but while allowing them to explore others to see what other talents either are hidden or undeveloped and come about later in time. So I'll get that for you.
So we'll have time for more discussion and questions a little bit later, but I want to make sure we get to some of these case studies and some of the interactive stuff we're going to be doing too. So hold your thoughts, because I'm sure they're good ones. So do you want to start with the case study?
Sure. So I'm going to go to one that probably works well in some places and not in others. My daughter goes to a Waldorf school. and they have some very specific organizational structures. They don't have a headmaster or a principal in the normal sense that a regular school would. They feel like a triad is better, and so they have someone that's a head of administration, somebody who is head of teacher and parent communications, and then someone that's a head of outreach, and that's my specific situation. But Steiner actually really just tried to design the first school like that, and so I'm just going to read a sentence that he wrote. A true teacher's republic, we will not be able to lean back and rest on the directives of a headmaster. We will have to bring to bear what gives each of us the possibility to take full responsibility for what we have to do, and each must be fully responsible. So it kind of, as a team, there are people who have skills and they join together to accomplish a greater goal, but they're all very responsible for their own role, and no one of them is saying and holding the other necessarily accountable like a headmaster would. It seems to work very well for them. The three different positions, and each school kind of does them a little bit different, but is a leadership role, which is the unifying force. So rather than a leader like we might think of them as a director and someone who orders people around, they're really meant to bring everybody together and bring everybody's great ideas and work into one cohesive whole that has movement. And then a management aspect, so somebody who's really good at managing the overall daily facilities, the people, and then an administrative aspect, because every business is going to have administrative needs and someone who needs to attend to those. So they're very, very specific that it's a collaborative path to finding a unifying force and a governance model that focuses on sustainability, accountability, and creativity being the three pillars of that. So the school that my daughter goes to, they seem to work really, really well together and do a great job at it. So that's an example of one that works well on a small scale, a group of three as the unifying force to lead a school.
Cool. So I'm going to share a situation I participate in where that I feel doesn't work very well, because it's kind of the tyranny of structure. It's a situation where I'm in a collaborative group that is so hamstrung by bureaucracy and regulations that it doesn't really do much. And that's Denver's Sustainable Food Policy Council. It's a group of, it's a great idea of, bringing together people from city government and people who are farmers and people who are food distributors all together to talk about how to make Denver's food system more sustainable. And how to kind of create a strong, resilient local food economy. And so it's this group that gets together once a month for a couple hours and is charged with kind of advising the city council and mayor on sustainable food policy. But the thing about the group is, one, they're kind of similar to a situation where there's a tyranny of structurelessness. There's not really kind of any people on the council that have more decision-making power than the others. And it's a pretty large group. It's about 25, 30 people. And so everybody is coming at it from a different place, and everybody has different ideas. And sometimes when you have all of these different ideas and no kind of way of sifting through them, it just becomes, design by committee and design of the lowest common denominator. What's the one thing that we can all agree on? Well, the city should purchase more local food, but it's too political to make it enforceable, so we should just say should. And so then it just becomes a recommendation that doesn't really have any teeth and doesn't drive any kind of meaningful change. And then in the meantime, there's like all these policies of how things are to be agreed upon, and the way it has to be framed in order to put it to the city that just make the process so slow that even if we did have policies that we were all really excited about and were pretty progressive, it would take a really long time for them to move through that whole process. So I still think it's a worthwhile group, and it's important to have groups like that, but that, from my perspective of analyzing these invisible structures, I'm seeing so many different connections and so much of, so many levels of this hierarchy at play, that it's kind of the worst of these two worlds rather than combining the best of them.
The other example I have, which I'm intimately involved with, is at the Central Rocky Mountain Permaculture Institute. So right now the only constants are Jerome and I, and with a flurry of other extremely talented, wonderful people that come in and out. So for the things that Jerome has done there in the last 30 years are amazing, and he's really been all of these things at the same time. Now he's doing a little bit of these things, definitely the elder, and so I step in to help out with these things. I definitely, with the network weaver, the translating, the facilitator, administrator, all of that, and what happens though is how many things can you do at the same time well? You can't. One or two people trying to do all of these things and be a visionary and keep moving forward and progressing and helping people and all of that, things are going to get dropped, things are not going to get taken care of. I'm not the best at all of these things. I can do administration. It's not my favorite thing, and I'm not that great at it. I can get it done though. And so I do. But if I could have a computer tech person, I would be in heaven. That stuff, the website gets done, but it gets done adequately to move forward slowly. So that's really, we need a team. If we're going to progress and move forward and go from being marginal at some things, really great at some things, and really just moving the whole organization forward, we're going to need other players that have skills to contribute to that. So it's moving, but it's not a full guild. We have a couple things, and we need for sure.
So the last case study I'm going to share is the group that I'm most intimately involved with, which is the Grow House. It's a nonprofit in Denver that's kind of in a big old greenhouse, and we do a bunch of things there. We grow food commercially, we teach about food through a number of different workshops and things like that, and we distribute food to folks in that neighborhood because there's not much access to healthy food in that part of town. And so I'm going to share kind of the process of how those structures got built out to where they are today. And so the whole thing started with a kind of elder, or you might say a visionary, who's this real estate developer in Denver who had a passion for local food and social justice. And so he bought this building, and then, you know, being this person in a position of authority and dealing with a lot of different projects, you know, he didn't have the time or knowledge to actually get a lot of it done. And so then he was introduced to me, and I started becoming more of that, you know, kind of administrator or network weaver, and starting to kind of bring people together. So I got, you know, at first we were kind of this loose network of people that were all kind of working together on a volunteer basis to kind of figure out what needed to be done and get things off the ground. And then we started applying for grants, we got our nonprofit status, and we had to organize a little bit more formally. And so then it shifted to this other structure where the original visionary became one of the members of the board of directors, which is, you know, kind of its own little network that reports to an executive director, who reports to a staff, which is a little bit more of a hierarchical structure. And then at that point, I decided that I actually didn't want to be in this role, even though I kind of, in the network version, I'd been kind of serving as that coordinator. I wanted to be in the staff in a specific position that would kind of fit my particular strengths better. And so we hired someone else as the executive director. The board, you know, meets with him on a regular basis, and then I work real closely with the executive director. And even though formally there's kind of this hierarchy going on, we're a much less kind of hierarchical organization than other, you know, institutions you might be familiar with. So ultimately, he has the decision-making power for the big decisions, but that he trusts, you know, me and another staff person who's in charge of growing commercially, and we have 2 staff people from our neighborhood that he really trusts to give feedback on what the community is thinking. And then from there, you know, we work with a whole set of interns and volunteers, and similarly, they're kind of in their own little network, communicating with each other and solving problems on their own, and then kind of taking big ideas and direction from the staff and executive directors. So you can see there's, like I was saying before, there's these 2 models of the network and hierarchy are kind of always shifting and interrelating with each other. And as an organization grows, it's kind of just important to understand, like, okay, is this a situation where I really need to just be telling people or giving them some direction? Or is this a situation where I want to step back and let the group wisdom kind of shine through because I'm not necessarily sure what the best role is? So that's kind of it for the case studies. So now we wanted to move to doing a little bit of kind of one-on-one discussion. So if you all want to find someone sitting next to you or near you that you didn't come here with, that you don't know very well. So pair up, find a partner, and we're going to ask you guys a few questions. It's a book called The Empowerment Manual. Starhawk's an amazing writer, and the way she chose to write this book is there's kind of this fictional narrative of a group that's going through conflict and how it solves it, and that narrative serves to highlight different things she's talking about kind of in a prose, nonfiction way throughout the book. It's filled with lots of really good exercises for groups to partake in and lots of really good practical advice. This is a book called People and Permaculture that just came out this year, and I actually just got it in the mail a few days ago, so I haven't even gotten a chance to really dig into it. But from what I can tell just from skimming it, it looks really cool. What's that?
Who wrote that?
It's a woman named Luby McNamara. And you can order it, there's like a British permaculture, she's British, and you can order it from a site online that they can ship it to you from. But similarly, it's filled with lots of different kind of case studies and exercises. This one in particular focuses on a specific kind and size of group that many of us are familiar with, and then this one kind of takes it everything from that kind of zone zero that you were talking about to how we work globally as a society in groups billion strong. So they're both kind of really great ways to kind of start mapping out these permaculture ideas onto collaborative groups. I know you have a few resources.
I do,
as well.
and so they're not necessarily relegated to the permaculture realm, my recommendations. There's a really good, it's an older book, they've redone it probably 1,000 times now, and it's the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And one of the kind of thing, at least in the permaculture design course I took, and probably a lot of others, is that permaculture is a big thing, and we unapologetically take from other sciences and other organizations and take what we want from it. And so there's lots of these things out there. The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, those are great for yourself personally. They're also great when you bring them to a community. Another one is nonviolent communication. They've got them with family, with children, in schools, kind of everywhere you would go with that. But communication really, none of this works unless we're listening to each other and talking to each other and talking from a place of openness and honesty, and really allowing someone to speak and listen to them without all of our preconceptions coming into play. We went to a TEDx last night, and I was looking for a way to bring one of these people into this conversation because it was so mind-blowing. But this one woman spoke, and she wrote a book on the colony bee collapse, and she's an environmental journalist. But her big point, so she starts going into these things on fracking and Monsanto, but not kind of, keep an open mind, it's not that bad, this kind of thing. And my environmental side is like getting agitated and not really wanting to listen to her. And, Monsanto is just bad, they're evil, that's just what it is. And so she brought up just that these are complex problems. And you really have to listen to the other side. You really have to listen to everybody to be able to hear what's going on. And there was a really great quote I actually read on the way here. It was, for every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. So to think that we know, just because, I don't like Monsanto, so they're obviously wrong, they're obviously responsible for colony collapse, and that's that, simple, done, clean. And it's just not, usually. And the more people we get involved in the conversation that we're actually listening to, probably the more creative and true our solution is going to be. That's all I have.
Okay, well, thank you guys.